This is a presentation of OneLogin training.
Welcome to How to Get Started with OneLogin Workforce Identity Part 6. Now, since it's so important to configure provisioning, again, part of Identity Lifecycle Management, if it is available, before you configure single sign-on for an app connector, we are going to next take a look at what provisioning is and how it's configured before we go on to configure other single sign-on options. Again, reasoning behind provisioning first is similar to why we wanted you to get the users into OneLogin before you configured policies and your app connectors. Need to make sure users exist in the apps first before you set them up to log into those apps. So, user provisioning is all about getting the user records you need into the applications themselves. It's, again, part of Identity Lifecycle Management. And when it's enabled and configured, it fires off automatically whenever a user is created or updated in OneLogin. So provisioning checks to see if the user exists first. If they don't exist, then it goes and creates them. Subsequently, whenever a user is updated within OneLogin, it sends updates over to the user record within the application. Again, it's going to update whatever fields basically you map over, those fields from OneLogin, standard fields or custom fields that you've created. You can map them to existing fields over in the application, called mapping parameters. We'll take a look at that later on. And finally, if a user is deleted from OneLogin, you can configure it to delete the user from the application, or perhaps just disable the user if that makes more sense for your use cases. So guess what? Order makes a difference. Just like it does when enabling OneLogin, makes a difference when setting up provisioning. So first, you need to match up which field or fields from OneLogin will be used to uniquely identify the user in the application. It will be among the basic parameters that you need to send to the application. Then you need to specify the URL endpoint of the app. Could be an actual URL. It's unique for your org, or just some sort of identifying value like a subdomain or ID that you've been assigned to by the application. Then you need to configure actual API access. Finally, you get to enable provisioning, which is followed by a step that we call refresh entitlements. Basically, when you refresh entitlements, OneLogin is taking that API access that you've set up, connecting to the application, and querying for like multi-valued fields that already exist within the application. So for example, Office 365, it would be querying for, well, what Office 365 groups have you already created in Office 365? Or Google, it's going to be querying for your Google groups. Then you can go ahead and finish configuring all these default parameters that you want to send across for your users when they're created over in the application, like what default Google group do I want them assigned to? And you can get extra special fancy and assign different sets of values, so different like default values for different sets of users using what we call rules. And rules are very similar to mappings, which we talked about in the last module, where we assigned users to groups using mappings. So each app connector will typically have one or two fields that are configured as basic parameters and are sent across to the application during provisioning and will be used to uniquely identify the user. So here we can see like Salesforce actually uses email and user ID, and we are using the email field from OneLogin to map to those fields over in Salesforce. So as parameters, we are sending email to match to email in Salesforce and email to match to user ID. If you look at the Office 365 v2 connector down at the bottom, You can see there are a few fields. Some of them are automatically generated, like the immutable ID, but there's user principal name there, the UPN. So by default here, you can see we're mapping again that email field from OneLogin to the UPN that'll be used over in Azure AD and Office 365. Now, if that user is coming from actual AD on-prem, right, ADDS, Active Directory, Directory Services, then they'll actually have a UPN or user principal name stored within OneLogin fields. So you could change that if you wanted to. You could say, okay, let's map it to the UPN field that we got from Active Directory. Trick is basically we want to make sure that these values are configured correctly early on in this process, because we don't want to mistakenly start creating users over in these applications, then change our mind later on, because it'll end up creating like duplicate users, because one user, maybe it's their email address, another user it's their UPN, and they're actually different values for them. Next step, we want that URL or domain name. Again, uniquely identifies the application instance, and we're going to configure the API access. Both steps are actually performed on the configuration tab, but again, will differ depending on the application. As you can see here, Samanage on the left needs an account name and username and password for a user account in Samanage that can hit the API, while Salesforce over on the right uses a login URL that has a unique Salesforce org ID at the end, and it uses OAuth to actually enable API access. So when you click on that authenticate button there, then you click, this little guy pops up, you click on Salesforce, you need to log into Salesforce with admin credentials and tell Salesforce, yeah, OneLogin can connect. You can trust them. Finally, you can actually check the checkbox to enable provisioning. Again, simple little checkbox. Just need to check it and click Save for this step. Once you've done the enable provisioning and click Save, then you want to come back over to the provisioning tab, and you're going to click that little refresh under Entitlements. This step triggers OneLogin again to connect to the application using that API access you already set up and pull in these multi-value fields. Okay, so it'll enable you then to assign users to those values. So again, like I'm querying to Salesforce, like what are the roles that already exist in Salesforce? So now when I go set up the parameters for my Salesforce users that I want to create, I can say, okay, this is the default role that I want you to be assigned to. How will I know what roles are available unless I do that querying ahead of time? So refresh entitlements is all about, again, querying to that application, pulling in those multi-valued fields over into OneLogin so we can use them to set parameters for our users. After we do the refresh entitlements, again, those values are going to be available on the parameters tab. So we're going to go back over to the parameters tab, and now we can match up other fields. So we can match up things like, here we see G Suite, and there's groups. And if I click on no transform there, I'm going to see all my Google groups. So I can choose which Google group I want them to belong to by default. Okay. Again, company news, HR team, product, support, those would not show up unless I'd done that refresh entitlement step. Entitlements in general refers to fields in the application that are relating to like permissions, like what a user is authorized to do within the application. Though there are other multi-valued fields that can be pulled in, but that's why we call it refresh entitlements actually. While you're going through and configuring the rest of those parameters, you can also decide, again, what other values do I want to send across? Here we're looking at G Suite, and there's lots of other fields that we can set. So, for example, phone there down at the bottom. By default, it's not going to send a phone number over for a user. But if I have their phone number field over in OneLogin, why not send it over to G Suite? So it'll be available over there. So I can just select where it says no default up pops a dialog you see over there on the right hand side, and I can match it to the existing phone field in OneLogin. So again, what's going to pop up in that drop down underneath value will be all my standard fields in OneLogin, as well as any custom fields that I have created for my users. Again, this is why how the users are created is so important. Now, in some cases, I don't want to actually match it to an exact field. Maybe I want to hard code in a value. So we do have the ability to put in static values. So here you're seeing like the language field. I'm going to choose macro and I can type in EN there. So everybody by default, their language will be English. These macros also support what we call macro attributes. Basically kind of like placeholders. So if you had, for example, display name and you wanted their first name and last name in there, you could use macro attributes to concatenate first name space last name. Makes the life a little bit easier. There's actually a full name one as well, but it can be a little bit more creative basically as to what you're sending over for those parameters. Now, once we finish with the parameters, then we might want to tweak some of the default behaviors as far as how the provisioning goes. So you might want to ask yourself again, maybe when a user is deleted from OneLogin, what do we want to have happen over in the application? Or if we remove the user's access from the application, what do we want to have happen to that user account over within the application? So that first option, when users are deleted in OneLogin and the user's app access is removed, perform the below action. That's how we can tweak that behavior. So in this case, by default, it wasn't going to do anything. Maybe we want it to suspend the user automatically if the user is deleted or removed from the application. And then the second, when user accounts are suspended in OneLogin, what do we want to do? Do we want to also automatically suspend them in the application, which is the default, or maybe do nothing? The other three options, again, on this provisioning tab are the create user, delete user, update user. But be careful. Read the first line there. Require admin approval before this action is performed. So at first glance, you might have thought that those checkboxes control whether or not provisioning will automatically create, update, or delete users. They don't. No matter what, provisioning is going to attempt to create, update, and delete users in response to users being created, updated, or deleted in OneLogin. These options control whether or not the actions will be automatically sent to the application, or are they going to wait for an admin to come along and approve the action before it's sent over to the application. By default, all those checkboxes are checked, meaning by default, when you enable provisioning, it's actually not going to automatically create, update, or delete the user in the application. It's going to wait for you as an administrator to come along and say, okay, you can go ahead and do this. And it's a good thing, because when you first set this up, you might have messed up a few of those parameters and such, and you want to make sure that this is flowing correctly. So you don't want it just sort of firing off without you knowing what's going on. Once you get it set up and it's run through a few times and you've approved it and it's working the way that you expect it, then you can come along and clear some of these checkboxes. And you don't have to clear all of them. Maybe, automatically create users, automatically update users, but you want the delete process to go through an approval. And the approvals you can find all over underneath users provisioning. So users menu, choose provisioning, and you will see any tasks that are waiting on your approval. Again, provisioning available if you have that full lifecycle management. And when it's enabled, configured, your user workflow could be such that when the user is created in OneLogin, however that user gets created in OneLogin, be it through HR sync, Active Directory sync, manually, whatever, mappings fire off looking at those users' attributes and automatically assign them to a role, which we will talk about in a little bit. And that role assigns them to an application like Salesforce. And because Salesforce has provisioning enabled, voila, users created over in Salesforce. So from day one, that user now has access to Salesforce. And again, remember, I can assign those entitlements, like what Salesforce role within Salesforce I want them to be assigned to. So they are assigned the correct permissions within Salesforce. And then if they leave the organization, decide what to do. I can either automatically delete or disable them within, again, the application itself. Whew. All right, so let's take a look at how all of this comes together. All right, so let's just kind of walk through where those provisioning steps are going to take place. So we start off, again, typically going in and adding in the app connector. In this case, we'll use Salesforce as an example, and we'll kind of switch back and forth between a brand new added Salesforce app connector and one we already have configured, just to make life a little bit easier. So add in the basic app connector. Again, I'm going to click on add apps. I'm going to type in Salesforce here, hit enter. I actually have a whole bunch of options when it comes to Salesforce. General rule of thumb, go for the one that has the most features. It's a good bet, actually. Really, you want one that has provisioning capabilities, and SAML or OIDC is an option as far as single sign-on authentication methods. So the one that's just called Salesforce is really used like 95% of the time. The rest of these are used for very specific use cases. So I'm going to click on the one called Salesforce. Again, I already have one pre-configured, so we'll call this Salesforce New. Now, this guy did have a choice between Forms authentication and SAML authentication. So notice if I scroll down towards the bottom, that's where I can actually specify the authentication method that we want to use. We will stick to the SAML one, which also, again, includes the provisioning, and click Save. So at this point, I would first go to that configuration tab. And this is where I want to specify this Salesforce login URL in this case. Again, exactly what I'm specifying there might be slightly different depending upon the application. Sometimes it's just like an org ID or an account ID I might specify. In the case of Salesforce, I'm specifying the entire login URL, which looks something like this, but this org ID piece is actually grabbed from Salesforce. So technically I'd have to go over into Salesforce, and I need to look underneath my company settings, and I'd want to go to company information and grab this org ID from over here, and then just sort of paste it in there. All right, so I just sort of start off like that. I'd also want probably the most recent version of the API. So 4.9 is now currently the most recent version, and I would click Save. So again, those first steps were to specify the endpoint and then come and enable the API access, which would mean in the case of Salesforce with this particular version of the API, I would want to click on this Authenticate button down here. So it's going to set up basically an OAuth connection to Salesforce, where I need to make sure that I'm logged into Salesforce with administrative credentials, which I am. And because I was logged in with those administrative credentials, I was allowed to make that OAuth connection over to Salesforce. So now I specified the endpoint and I have configured OAuth down over here. So for the rest of these steps, let's go to one that actually I already set up. Just going to make it a little bit easier. So we'll go over to my main Salesforce app. So next step would be going to provisioning and checking this little checkbox right there, which again, in this case is already checked because I've already configured this particular app connector, but we'll check it for the fun of it. Click Save. And then go back over to the provisioning tab and click this little refresh link over here. So went by really quickly, right? Like, what happened? Well, again, that's where it connected to Salesforce and pulled in those entitlements. And we can actually see like the event started, and if we refresh a couple of times, we'll actually see when it finished over here. So what it's doing in the case of Salesforce is pulling in values for like Salesforce role or my Salesforce permission sets. So let's go look at Salesforce and take a look at our parameters tab. So again, there's a couple times when we might be coming over to this parameters tab. One, to make sure that that initial identifying value is mapped to what we want it to map to. In the case of Salesforce, the email field and the user ID down here. So might have done that before we enabled provisioning because we knew it was set correctly. I didn't modify it then, but we can always come in. Still at this point, we haven't provisioned any users, so we could technically change it to something else, like maybe their SAM account name if we wanted to, but I will keep that the same. And what we can see then though is if we go to something like permission sets here and I click this drop down, the fact that I see all these options like sales user PSL, scheduling, facility manager, etc. These are all the permission sets that exist within my Salesforce instance. They are able to be seen here because I did that refresh entitlement step. We can see the same thing over here with, say, profiles. These are all the profiles that exist within my Salesforce instance. And again, we're pulled into OneLogin so I can see them here because of that refresh entitlement step. So now I can actually kind of go through and figure out, well, which one of these values, do I want to set defaults for? So in this case, like permission set, I've set to Sales Console user, and profile I've set to standard user, and role even. This is another one of those pieces that got pulled over. These are all existing roles in my Salesforce instance, and I'll leave it to installation and repair services. Always making sure that if I want it to be sent across as part of provisioning, to make sure this checkbox here is checked. Include in user provisioning. So in fact, that is done for each one of these. Include in user provisioning. And profiles. Include in user provisioning. So we've got most of this set at the moment. We can go over and even look and see, in fact, if we go to users, that we'd created a user over here already through provisioning. Remember our friend Blake Cat? Well, Blake Cat has been provisioned into Salesforce. We've got his job title got copied over here. We can see he was created as a standard user. His role is installation and repair services. All these bits of information are based upon the fact that we have permission sets, profile, role. These are default values that were sent over when he was provisioned, and even matched his title from OneLogin to the title field over in Salesforce, and check the checkbox, include in user provisioning. So what happens if, say, we change some values from him? So let's go to Blake here, and maybe he just got a promotion. So we're going to make him a senior support engineer. And now, save those changes. So, let's look over here. Did that change come over here? No, we kind of feel like it should have, right? But it still says support engineer. Well, I'll tell you actually, we weren't configured to automatically send it over. Remember these little check boxes over on that provisioning tab. These guys here require admin approval before the action is performed. By default, they're all checked. So it's waiting for me to approve the fact that that update should go over there. So how can I go approve it? I'm going to go to provisioning, and I can see this update is waiting for me to approve it, and I'm going to approve it. Okay. Now, task should be completed successfully. Now, let's go over here and refresh. What does it say? It says Senior Support Engineer. Woohoo! Okay, so that is provisioning at work. Again, why it's so important for that user information to be accurate and up to date within OneLogin. So what if we don't want to have to approve that? We think our provisioning is working great now. Anytime a user needs to be created, anytime they're updated, we don't want to have to go through an approval process. Well, go change the settings over here on the provisioning tab. In fact, let's clear the checkbox next to update user. So maybe we'll create it, create and delete. We still want to kind of control the licenses, so we'll keep those under approval. But the updates, cool. Go ahead, change his job title anytime you want to. So we're going to save that change, and now let's promote Blake once more. We're going to make him a senior support engineer. Well, let's see. Support engineer manager. That looks good. All right, let's save him. So, was he updated? I don't know. Let's go see. Let's do a little refresh over here now. It might take a few seconds, so hopefully it did it quick enough. And I will be satisfied. Yay! Senior Support Engineer Manager. Again, automatic provisioning. Create a user. Assign the user to the application. We're going to see the user within the application. In this case, we're looking at the update process. Update that user. User's automatically updated within the application. That is provisioning at work. And remember, we can even do a bit of fine tuning when it comes to setting parameters for particular sets of users during provisioning. We can create rules, like those mappings. Remember those guys? Again, we talked about them before with users assigning them to groups. Well, rules are similar, but they're created at the application level instead of at that full OneLogin account level. So rules are if-then statements that look at user attributes. And if the user matches the conditions that are defined in the rule, then the actions will be applied to the user. The actions then are assigning values to the parameters that are being sent to the application. For example, might create a rule that looks at a user's job title and the region they're in, and assign them to a particular role in Salesforce. Again, rules only work if that user information is accurate and up to date. It's looking at those user fields. Now, where are they created? They are created at the application level, so you will find them on the app connector. Mappings fire off for the whole OneLogin account, so they're underneath the user menu. Rules define per application, so app connector level. And rules only affect the parameters that are being sent to the application during provisioning. But order makes a difference. Again, otherwise they're very, very similar to mapping. So order can make a difference, and they only fire off when users are created or updated. So when you go and manually create a bunch of rules, or you're changing the definition of existing rules, and you want those changes or those new rules to apply to existing users, there is a manual step For rules, it's called reapply entitlement mappings. Yes, that's somewhat confusing, but that is what it is called. So let's finish up that provisioning configuration by creating a couple of rules. So let's get a little bit more specific about those parameters that we are passing over, in this case, to Salesforce, and check out some rules. So in this case, I actually already have some rules that I've created. So you can see a couple of them here. Creating the rules themselves, very simple. Again, they look exactly like mappings. In fact, it says new mapping here. And so we can go create the engineering team. Again, it's a rule. I know it says mapping. They were once called entitlement mapping, so that's why it says that there. Anyway, so what we're going to do here is set condition, and in this case, we will say if department equals engineering, then, and let's play with the role over in Salesforce. So it's not the role in OneLogin. This is where mappings and rules do differ. These actions are going to be very specific to changing fields within the application. So I can change user ID, permission sets, time zone, manager, title. A lot of those same fields that were on that parameters tab, we would see here in our actions. So in this case, let's go change his role. Now remember, his current role in Salesforce, I'm, by the way, planning on torturing Blake Hat again because he's in engineering. So his current role is installation and repair services over here. So let's just change it to be something different from this list. Let's do customer support international and click save. So now we say if somebody's department equals engineering, then go assign them to that particular role within Salesforce versus over here, the default role for everybody is actually installation and repair services. And let's go double check on Blake to make sure he's in engineering. He might not be in engineering. Depends on what I've up. He's in support. So let's go change him. So this actually works for him. And by modifying him right there, that should kick off the rule. Because rules, like mappings, fire off anytime a user is created or updated. So I've now updated Blake over here. I've changed his department to be engineering. Therefore, he should match the criteria that was set in the rule on Salesforce. Right? Department equals engineering. Therefore, he should now be assigned to the customer support international role over in Salesforce, and it should automatically be occurring because I cleared the update user checkbox over here, so it's not requiring me to do any administration approval process. So let's go take a look over at Salesforce and refresh Blake's record. And check it out. His role in the upper right-hand corner now says Customer Support International. Thus, we have been very specific in assigning roles to subsets of users based upon their user attributes. So what's it important to have? User attributes, accurate and up to date. This concludes part 6 of how to get started with OneLogin Workforce Identity. Please continue on to our final part 7.
This is a presentation of OneLogin Training.